Sarah leads the global portfolio for the Rockefeller Foundation's food team, leading such signature initiatives as the Food Systems Vision Prize. In this capacity, she's driving the foundation's inaugural regenerative food system strategy and leading the articulation of a big bet for food plus climate for the foundation. She also directs the diet quality portfolio and is expanding the good food purchasing portfolio and true cost accounting work globally with the aim of shifting the diet quality of 500 million underserved people by 2030. That's pretty good. There you go. Previously, Sarah co-founded the Global Knowledge Initiative, which she led for a decade, nurturing it from a concept to an organization designated as one of the top 100 social innovations for the next century. During her time at GKI, she cultivated a dynamic team that she led in the design and execution of GKI's program in systems research and evaluation, network optimization, and collaborative innovation strategy setting, work that included serving the Rockefeller Foundation's Social and Innovation Lab on waste and spoilage. Prior to GKI, she spent a decade as an innovation strategist for the World Bank. She's been commissioned by national governments and international development organizations to lead thinking, develop and facilitate networks, and devise policies to strengthen developing countries' science and innovation. Equal parts facilitator, systems thinker, collaboration maker, and strategist, she graduated with honors from the Science, Technology, and Society from Stanford University School of Engineering, where she earned a master's degree in international policy studies. Following her time at Stanford, Sarah did postgraduate study in technology policy and management at the Universidad de Buenos Aires as a Rotary International Ambassador Fellowship. Her list of publications including 70 monograms, studies, and papers. What a bibliography. Welcome, Sarah Farley.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that extensive introduction. I have to say my reflection of being here so far today almost feels like being a time traveler. From Dr. Ron Weiss to all of the speakers, but really the spirit each of you bring, it's a glimpse into a future. It really is a future that we're striving for with every bite we eat, with the mindfulness of how we produce it, with the thoughtfulness of all the goods that come into our lives per the last fabulous speaker. And I really do want to believe, I think it was Dr. Weiss that said, 99.9% of people don't know what you know in this room. That will change, but it means you are really, really important. So it's with humble gratitude I spend this time with you. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, I think, from some of the other speakers, which is we're not just going to be time travelers, we're going to be space travelers. We're going to zoom way, way out. We're going to take a look at this phenomenon of regeneration at a global level, and then I want to sort of peek behind the curtain and invite you into the space of philanthropy and share a little bit about what we're doing at the Rockefeller Foundation and how we're trying to activate actually a lot of other foundations to support the kind of work that you're all a part of here at Ethos Farm. Let's zoom out. So there's this construct of planetary boundaries. Is that a construct folks are following? Planetary boundaries? Yes. Okay. For a lot of folks, it's new. This is some incredible scientific work led by folks at the Stockholm Resilience Institute, as well as many others around the world. And what they've done is they've tried to calculate basically the good stuff we need on this planet for it to thrive, and for us as human beings to survive, but for our natural systems, our biosphere to survive as well. So what you see on the left, these are these dimensions, these unique planetary boundaries. It's almost like a budget. Like if I give my son, who ran up here and gave me a kiss, if I give him $1 and he wants to buy something that costs $1.50, he has overused his budget. He only has $1. So this is like our budget of stuff. And you can see on the graphic, we have things like stratospheric ozone. We need that. Our planet needs that. We have things like biogeochemical deposits, right? Whether that's fossil fuels, other things. Land systems. There's only a certain amount of land operating a certain way, and we don't have more land. There isn't somewhere to go. So what this commission, what this work is doing is it's calculating what is our deficit, kind of where are we on the spend of these planetary boundaries. This is not a pretty picture. Those bars where you see the red pie slices, that's where we are. They use the fancy word transgressing. we are spending the $1.50 of the dollar. So what you take away from the picture, right now we are operating outside of Earth's limits, as if the Earth has infinite space and size and abundance, as if there is no consideration of our need to conserve. And now it gets a little self-incriminating for those of us that care about food. Guess who the big budget-killing, budget-destroying sector is of all the sectors? It's us. It's food. So you can see here, land systems change. 80% of that change, of that transgression of the planetary limit, food. Freshwater use, 84% food. Biosphere integrity, biogeochemical flows, and climate change itself. So this notion of regeneration, the reason it matters so much is because we are beyond the pale a tremendous contributor to the challenge of our planetary boundary transgression. So then we've heard this word today, and all of you clearly as part of this community have a sense of what regeneration is, but for most people it's still a totally fringe concept. I have lots of friends that I talk to about my passion for this work who are like, so is it organic? Like what's the difference? I don't see this at all in the marketplace. And it's true. It is almost invisible in the marketplace to go regenerative. And as I've been doing this work and coming into a community of scientists and farmers, indigenous land stewards, corporates, and others, I realize, wow, we have a rainbow of definitions on this term. And on one hand, that's good. It means people are sort of bringing their own perspectives. That's important. But it's also potentially really dangerous because of greenwashing. And I'm going to get into exactly how that phenomenon is taking place right now with this term. But I want to offer a way to think about this idea of regeneration, pulling from many people with a lot more wisdom and connection to this lived experience than I have. But on behalf of many groups, here's a kind of take at regeneration. A regenerative system is one that makes more than it takes, right? So you're building back that budget, you're not depleting it. And then it kind of has three pieces. One, it's based in principles. Now this principles piece is so important, and what you start to recognize when you take this principles-based approach is how for a lot of companies and others coming into regeneration, they're not talking necessarily about principles, and that becomes a real red line for people that feel if we're serious about this, principles are the first thing. And what might those principles be? Renewable, resilient, equitable, diverse. We had a great question in the back about, but who can afford all this? If we don't think with this equity lens, we never answer that question. The next piece, it's principles-based and measurable through outcomes. So we've calculated there is 115 existing metrics and tools to measure regen. There's not one, there's not two, there's over 100. And that becomes challenging because many of them are practice-based. It's if you do X, if you do Y, we're gonna count you as regen. The problem is not everything works everywhere. What we really need to get clarity on is what are we doing this for? We are doing this to sequester GHG. We are doing this to build soil health. We are doing this to build back biodiversity, build back water quality, and I hope we're doing this for farmers and for social equity. Those outcomes need to be the centerpiece of the definition, and I think I'm going to share a little bit about where we're seeing the kind of global conversation on regenerative go, and I think this notion of outcomes-based is really gaining ascendance. And yes, it's practiced with some very specific techniques, many of which are used right here at Ethos Farm. No-till, cover crops, living roots, etc. So this is a kind of offering, looking at all these different definitions, trying to make sense of how these different groups are operating and coming into the notion of regenerative. I like a simple analogy. And so the simple analogy is a swimming pool. You got shallow ends, you have a deep end. So shallow end regenerative is when we only talk about soil health and GHGs. Is that bad? No, it is so much better than conventional industrial ag with all those synthetic inputs, synthetic pesticides, absolute GHG emissions, right? Absolutely, shallow has a place. But we don't get to the kind of middle of the swimming pool until we actually measure and monitor, are we building back biodiversity? And that biodiversity is above the soil and it's below. Microbial biodiversity is part of how you get that soil health, to get that healthy plant to get that healthy person, right? So we need this microbial abundance and we need species richness. We need to build both back. We don't care about that if we're over here in the shallow end. But you could do all those. You could get gold star on biodiversity, gold star on water, gold star on GHGs, and the farmer is getting nothing. And guess who doesn't want to be a farmer? Most people in the world today are getting out of farming faster than they ever have. That's true in Africa, it's true in the United States, it's true on every continent in the world, because they see how hard it is. They see the climate changing, they see how their parents struggled. So if we want people to want to be regenerative farmers, to take the risks that Dr. Ron Weiss and his team have taken, we've got to put farmers at the very center of this idea. And that means, do they make some money? And more than money, what about well-being? Well-being is spiritual, it's psychological, it's mental health, it's knowing your child can go to school, pursue a career, it's your ability for your community, which you've really built here in such a tremendous way. But even potentially more profound, it's spiritual integrity. I think one of the problems regenerative as a term has, it is viewed, I think, with a lot of credibility as a very neo-colonialist construct. I mean, what of indigenous people that have practiced regenerative, in no way using that word, for thousands of years, and then largely northern institutions, corporates, philanthropies, and yes, some farmers say, we're going to call this thing regenerative, not acknowledging that indigenous wisdom, not even positioning indigenous wisdom at the center of the conversation. So you don't even have to care about any of that if you're not in the deep end. So putting this notion of our swimming pool of regenerative for Rockefeller Foundation, where we want to go with our strategy, we want to push incentives toward the deep end. We want to get everybody in the pool, and we want to get them down here. We want to drive the money there, the incentives, the policy, all of it. So why regen? I think we kind of made the case here. It's about those planetary boundaries. It's about health and healing. It's the why. All of you hold a why, that you came on this rather hot Saturday into this tent to be in this community together. Those whys are sacrosanct, and some of them are biophysical and environmental. Many of them are about human health and about community. Why now? Because these rates of transformation are moving at such a clip. You know, one of the things that really worries me is soil health, and specifically topsoil. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates by the year 2100, which sounds far away, it's honestly not that far away, we may have lost 90% of planet Earth's topsoil. Like, you literally cannot grow food without topsoil, unless your vision of food futures, and some hold this, is soilless agriculture, which divorces us from the land. Okay, so why RF? Why the Rockefeller Foundation? We need some convening in here. We need credibility, and we need to bring a blend of knowledge types, indigenous knowledge, traditional wisdom, local community, lived experience, and yes, the best of science and innovation. So with all that, what are we learning? There is such awesome research coming out right now on regenerative. So I want to profile one of our grantees. He is this incredible scientist named Jonathan Lundgren. He was a scientist who became a farmer because he felt he was a charlatan, not being able to really speak with the intimacy of the connection to the land. And he's on Blue Dasher Farms. This is in South Dakota. And he's created this, it's called a foundation, but really it's a movement called the Ecdysis Foundation. And they, at present date, have the largest field-to-field comparison of regenerative performance against conventional farms in the United States. So you're gonna get to 1,000 farms. There are almost 400. And what's incredible is we're really starting to have the data story that we didn't have before. This slide has way too much text, but let's talk about some of what we're seeing. We're seeing the soil organic matter increase, right? So trying to escape this fate predicted by the FAO. We are sequestering carbon. That's another one of the big whys. The ability of soils to hold water. I've been talking to a lot of scientists about the recent fires in Hawaii and what could have happened were there richer soils with greater water retention, not just in Hawaii. I'm originally from California, where forest fires are decimating Northern California, where I'm from, once every year, if not 2 or 3 years when we're lucky. And so it's imperative that our soils are able to retain water, and that's something we see, even with the kind of midpoint. But then the thing that's incredible, and I think if this weren't the case, this transition and the optimism to think we really can go from conventional to regenerative, if farmers weren't able to make money, if this was only a losing game, this would be a hard stone to push up the hill. And you'll see this data differs in different contexts, but in the United States, from this large comparative analysis, net profits of regenerative farms are unaffected over time from this transition, meaning they're not doing worse. And that's before we repurpose subsidies to actually put some fuel in the tank for this transition. But also, and I think, you must be believers on this to be part of the Ethos farm enterprise, but the nutritional profile of foods themselves is changing. The actual biomolecular structure of food is changing. The nutrient density of foods is changing. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a scientific effort that we've stood up to prove that. There's good news around the world, though. So even beyond the United States, actually the largest study ever in terms of just number of farmers involved in the study just was published about 4 weeks ago, and this is in Andhra Pradesh. So there's and maybe something getting back to what is regenerative. In the same way that there's different definitions of regenerative, there's different terms that still mean regenerative. They make sense in context. In Andhra Pradesh, the flavor of regenerative is called community managed natural farming. You can see on that little box on the bottom right in gray, what are they doing when they do natural farming? And you can see it has a number of practices we would see consistent with regenerative. So with 6 million farmers, what are we seeing across Andhra Pradesh? We are seeing the economic terms, average yield increases. This is huge, right? Because there are critics that say, but what happens when we get to 10 billion people? Does this work? Can you actually pull it off? So we need productivity. We can't not have production from plants. So the fact we're seeing productivity increases really matters. Second, the net increase in income is 2x. 2x. So whereas in the United States, the farm economic structure is just different around the world, but in India, 2x income. That's the difference between your kids going to school, you getting help for a medical condition. It is tremendous. Okay, but let's talk about greater social capital, greater empowerment of women, greater, again, nutritional profiles, and less exposure to the toxins related to the application of synthetic pesticides, synthetic fertilizer. So this Andhra Pradesh study is one to watch. Woodwell, formerly Woods Hole, Woodwell is doing a longitudinal study, but there is a lot happening here, and Prime Minister Modi announced an intent to shift the whole of India to community-managed natural farming. Now, we don't have a timeline for that, and this could take many different directions, but even that conviction and what it would mean on the global stage if a continent of more than 1 billion people went this way, that's quite a proof point. But even beyond these examples, what we're seeing in corporate America is rather interesting as well. You can see a few examples here of corporates that are making regen claims. That's maybe good. And then here's the bad news. There is a recent analysis of corporate commitments to regen. It's now 60%. 60% of the largest food and beverage companies are saying, we're going regen or we are regen. But remember the swimming pool. What kind of regen? Where are we? What about principles? What about outcomes? And are those outcomes only GHG and soil? Do we care about farmers? We're finding from that analysis less than 30% of corporates are actually defining regen, let alone measuring it. Less than 12% of corporates are putting any money into their farmers to go on the journey. So if you want to source to me, says large company X, go for it. Be regen, but get there on your own. That's not much of a transition strategy. So now the peek behind the curtain. So with that kind of state of play, the why for regen, the evidence that we're starting to see come in, the, I think, increased wave of enthusiasm for corporates, what can an institution like the Rockefeller Foundation do? And there's a lot of things we can't do, but what we're playing with is this sort of mix of tactics. So there's a lot here. We need to get our arms around this shared definition if we're to hold corporates to account, if we're to pave the way for farmers to take on this journey, that means new financing. We got to measure this stuff. We got to figure out, like, does no-till and living roots, does that work absolutely everywhere? Does it work in Niger? Does it work in, just in the Sahel? What about blue foods, fish, etc., kelp, algae? There are other things, seaweeds. What is regenerative in an aquatic sense? We've got to sort all that out. We do think this critical issue of a lack of a consolidated, shared, outcomes-based definition is going to allow for a tremendous amount of greenwashing. And when that happens, it means no one's going to have faith in this term. They're not going to buy foods even if they were available in the marketplace. So we've got to solve this problem. And corporates can't solve that problem. Philanthropy can't solve that problem. Farmers can't even solve that problem, nor can scientists. It really is like a whole of systems approach. So Regen 10 is a network of networks that is built by, with, for indigenous people as landscape stewards, corporates, farmers, science, funders. And it has been going for about 2 years, and it's taking the designers of those 115 measurement tools of regenerative, it's kind of putting them in an arena to say, all right, what do we make of this? Like, what's the center point? What's the fulcrum? What can we all consider at the very base, like the floor? What's the floor beneath which we're just not going to use the word regenerative? My own sense is that that floor needs to be over here on the deep side, and that we can provide incentives to come along that way. But I think about labor alone. In slave labor, there is slave labor in our commodities. You can be a plant-based eater and still be supporting slavery. Today, it happens. And that's true in cocoa. It's true in a number of sectors. If you're not thinking about people, you will not solve that challenge. And to me, supporting GHGs, biodiversity, and water, as critical as those are, I don't want a food system based on slave labor. And I don't think any of us do. All right, so Regen 10, it's going to work on this outcomes framework, really trying to get harmonization. And then it wants to provide a kind of like connective tissue that can connect the Ron Weisses and the team here at Ethos to other practitioners that are growing similar foods in a kind of similar agroecological zone to say, what are you doing? What are you trying? I'm not getting the biodiversity results. You are. Let's exchange data. Let's exchange practice. Like, we really need to build that web for knowledge exchange. Then we've got to solve another problem where I think Rockefeller can be helpful, but it's so much bigger than us, which is we need a lot of money to do this. And partly we need a lot of money because right now today, $650 billion is the actual amount of subsidies globally going to conventional agriculture. So we have to think about that number, and then we have to think about the number of like, okay, so what does it cost? Like, what does it actually cost to go to regen? And the, ta-da, is we don't know, which is not super compelling to open purse strings. We need a number. So we are getting a whole bunch of philanthropies. We're at 20 so far, but these are 20 of the largest in the world. They bring a lot of capital, billions of dollars, together to one, let's get a real number, and a real number for deep. Like, what is this going to cost? And then let's figure out, like, and what do farmers need? What do landscapes need? Like, what does it look like year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4? Let's build the mountain of cash to really support that. So it will also require this kind of shared narrative because just like each of us, we all have our own worldview. I can't not be Sarah. I can build my empathy and connect to others and learn from others, but I still bring a worldview that is biased with these eyes that I have and these ears and this heart that I have. And so we need to open up those ways of seeing and feeling and being to build a sort of collective theory of transformation. What is this roadmap? How do we do this in service of others? That's what this group of philanthropies is going to do. And I'll say, we don't typically work like that. It's the case philanthropy can be very headstrong and kind of go in and solve challenges. So the idea of saying, whoa, let's learn and listen. Let's build a large coffer, larger than we could have done alone. And then let's really build the narrative that's going to activate policymakers, corporates, and others. That's what this piece is all about. And here's a kind of way to visualize it all. If we don't take these strides with farmers and landscape stewards at the center, and it's just so neat being here at Ethos where the farmer is also the healer, and that it's really one and the same. Again, that's why this feels like future time travel, because that is so, so, so rare. But farmer, landscape steward, farmer as healer, those are the folks at the middle. That's who we need to optimize for. And I think the rest of this flywheel will start to turn. And the last bit of the puzzle is we as funders, we're funding evidence. We need more evidence to convince policymakers. If we want to redirect subsidies, which means changing the farm bill, not easy stuff, to do that, we need a lot more evidence. And I think let's do it. Let's get the dollars, let's find the partners, let's build the evidence. And evidence is coming from this very place. So just a closing remark here, both to recognize the absolute centrality of the soil on which we stand here, the centrality of soil in the web of life, soil as the kind of heart from which regeneration builds, but also recognizing this is not a story of soil alone. It is a story of soil as really a metaphor for humanity's connection to each other, connection to the natural world of which we are a part. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. It's a big project, right? And the great thing about what they're doing at the Rockefeller Foundation is they've got the resources to look at this at a level that small people like us don't. But they still care about the people at our level, witness Sarah being here. We actually got a very lovely visit with them earlier this year with the folks from Rockefeller. We're hopeful that we'll have a chance to work together. Just really great folks and great people.
I wanted to know if you could speak to trends within the United States and then even globally about corporate land purchases in the agriculture industry. That's something that's come onto my radar just like in the last couple years. Yeah. So I'm wondering about power shifts, and then at a time, as we all know, this kind of narrative of smaller farmers feeling squeezed out of the field, which is something that Dr. Weiss and everyone here is working against. Yeah. There might even be like this new front to make things harder. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about facts and data about that. Thank you.
It's such a critical piece of this puzzle. You know, just you put on like a sheerly capital economics lens and you look at food, it's impossible to describe the modern food and agriculture industry as anything but an oligopoly. Like the level of consolidation around seeds, fertilizer, other inputs, and then more and more the size of the farm itself. All of that points to oligopolistic behavior, and actually President Biden himself has started to point that out in food, which let's see where that goes. So in terms of corporate land ownership, it is something to watch. And beyond corporate land ownership, foreign government ownership. I was listening to an NPR story actually recently about the ownership through an investment vehicle from UAE purchasing land in Arizona for high irrigation intensive agriculture. So even as you might get state leadership to say, we gotta talk about water intensivity, if that land is actually held by a foreign sovereign government, what of that? And I will say this phenomenon is challenging and is in the United States. It's at a whole other level in Africa. Incredible African scientists whose work I deeply respect and admire have referred to it as the second scramble for Africa, the first being for slave labor. That just purchasing up land, again, by corporates and foreign governments. So we really have to keep our eye on that. And what it means, I mean, there's a few implications for the regenerative work. We have to think about regeneration happening at multiple spatial scales. So there's a regenerative farm. We're right here in a regenerative farm. But as Dr. Weiss was sharing, you know, the neighbors may have had or continue to use a different approach to agriculture, a more industrial approach to agriculture. So you don't get to optimize for how that guy over there is applying pesticide and how polluted the waterway is if you're only looking through the lens of the farm. You look at the landscape level. And then corporates neither look necessarily only at a farm or landscape level, they look through the supply chain, right? So it's almost like the straw sucking through the landscape, the resources, right? So this regenerative transition, and then there's a policy layer, right? There is a policy layer that matters if we're gonna get subsidies and regulations. So this transition needs attention of those four layers, and I think if you take that sensitivity in conversations about land ownership, the fight looks different at those spatial scales, but we really do need to be thinking about fairness, equity, representation. And I would say, as a last and kind of like call to arms, you really have a voice as landscape stewards, as a community of actors. Like, you're showing what it looks like to care about landscape and to optimize for different outcomes. And the world is so hungry for examples, so hungry. World leaders are flooding New York in a week for the Climate Week and then the UN General Assembly. And regen is hugely on the table. There's actually a panel, and I'll share a little bit more about this. But what you're doing here, I think, does merit international attention.
Can we get an open source database of which companies meet which level of regenerative depth? From there, we could create reports and images and memes to help more people know the difference between greenwashing and real progress. Great question.
Love this question. Love this question. That is like central to what Regen 10 is absolutely intending to do. In fact, we recently did an analysis of what are the existing data environments that would make this possible. And again, there's a bunch. So how do we get one supercharged so that it's the one we get more corporates, more farmers, more landscape stewards to really share data within? And of course, there's massive impediments to do that from corporate data ownership, but that is the play. Whoever said that, you're on something. We need to make it happen.
So I think a lot of this comes down to who owns the earth. And when you look back at the seizure of the commons, when the people own the commons, and it went to the Lord, and then their labor had to go to that person who owned the earth. And you look at mass agriculture owning the earth, and that's where these economies of scale pay off. And we as a country, we tax a lot more on labor and a lot less on the land being a common source. I think there's Henry George looked at that hundreds of years ago, but it's the idea of how do we own this? And I think you're seeing that increased privatization and the forces that go to it. And how do we move, as we move to AI and all these other things as well, how do we move and get people to utilize the labor, take off the taxation and the things we put to restrict labor and give access to land, and look at those people who hoard land, who hoard our resources, and put the burden on those who pollute and do those resources. So just think about how do we move those, how do we recreate that in this country? Thanks.
It's such an inspired comment, and it makes me think of a friend who is a brilliant scholar and thinker and advocate on this, Raj Patel, who wrote The History of the World in 10 Cheap Things. And actually the first thing, so he looks at like, how do we get to this hyper-extractive economy where it is easier to imagine the end of the earth than the end of capitalism? How do we get here? And so we got here by commodifying and devaluing life, labor, land. He kind of works through all these things. And so he will give a profound answer, but I can say this is one more reason inclusion and representation at the table around the regen future matters so much, because if we're like, especially I think, as a person that hasn't lived the life of an indigenous person, a person of color, I can only understand this so much, but lived experience of being colonized and subjugated and made vulnerable through these systems, those are the voices that need to be heard. Because for them, this idea of like, how do we stop commodifying everything and work together? There's answers. We just have severed ourselves from them. So I think the answer lies in inclusion.
This is a serious question. Like, as I sit here and I'm like, okay, I'm mostly plant-based. I'm doing my thing, right? I'm getting healthy. And then I hear all this information and I think, okay, how do I, as like a private citizen, what would you suggest people, like all of us sitting here, like there's power in numbers, but some of this can be overwhelming, right? It's like, oh my God, we're facing like corruption on a global scale. What are things that are like practical that we can do to start shifting the tide and moving toward the deep end of the pool that you talk about?
Yeah, I so appreciate the question, and I almost have like two versions of an answer, because as a consumer right now, you can go into your store and start banging on the table to the store manager and be like, you gotta give me a regenerative granola. Like, I need one. I want these kinds of products. I know they're out there. So you can start demanding the products. And yet, like, this is so beginning. It is beginning now, and sort of bringing the products into the market, that I think the bigger work, like the harder load, honestly, is with, we got to get the subsidies, the policies right, and we got to start getting the flywheel turning with production. So all that to say, I think, ask in your markets, ask for regenerative produce. Now they may say, can you give me an example? There's 9 certifications. We have USDA organic. There actually are 9 certifications on regen. I can't even list them all off the top of my head. There's a number. So Whole Foods is affiliated with, I believe, 4. So you could go to your Whole Foods and say, I'm just not seeing them. I know you guys are behind some of these regen projects. Like, get them on the shelf. That's one thing. I think we can also talk to our congressmen, our senators, and say, what are we doing in terms of the land that we're using in this state, in this place, to disproportionately support regenerative producers? I've got a great example in my friends at Ethos Farm, but there are so many other farmers that don't operate in this way. What are you doing? And, all ships ultimately do come to the policy and advocacy in the United States around the Farm Bill. So, and as a foundation, I cannot tell you how to take those next steps, but steps can be taken.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.